Right, hi everybody, welcome back. I'm just going to take this opportunity to do what I hope is a very short video with a case study just to wrap up topic five. Topic five, I hope you remember, is concerns the topics of soil and terrestrial food production systems and societies. However, the case study I'm going to show you is probably applicable to other parts of the course as well, including environmental value systems and human populations and human population carrying capacity. So what I want to tell you is the story of one person, and that person is Professor Norman Borlaug. He's possibly the most important environmentalist that ever lived, and some people say he's probably responsible for saving more lives than any one person in history, upwards of possibly 1 billion people. Now, despite those claims, he's still probably somebody that you've never heard of, which is quite surprising, really. But I hope by the end of this you'll understand who he is. I actually also want to talk a little bit about the controversy that his work has resulted in as well. Um, he's one of the great environmentalists and one of the great humanitarians of the 20th and 21st century. Okay, so let's briefly go through his life and his work. He was born in 1914 to a poor farming family in Iowa, in the US. His parents were immigrants to the US from Norway, I believe. So he grew up on a farm where, in those days, they were basically small farms, small holdings, uh, where his father and himself were basically working subsistence farming. They were producing food for their own family rather than for profit or for sale, which was the case across a lot of the US at that time. So, growing up from 1914, he lived through some fairly momentous events at the start of the 20th century, including the First World War, the Spanish flu pandemic, uh, and then the Dust Bowl events that affected a lot of the breadbasket states of the US, including Iowa. Iowa wasn't the worst hit, possibly that was Kansas and Oklahoma. But as a child and a young adult, he was very aware of, first of all, the effects of the Dust Bowl, health effects, the effects on farming, employment, and then obviously he lived through the Great Depression that followed, even prior to the Second World War. So by the time he became a young adult and he went to university, he decided to devote his life to solving the problems of agriculture, to allowing farmers in the US and beyond to get out of poverty, um, to have crops that were very, very efficient, and be able to make a profit. Um, so he went to the University of Minnesota in 1937, where he got his degree in forestry, and then he stayed and completed his PhD in plant pathology in 1942. So that's the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. So then, as a postdoc in 1942, he decided to go to Mexico because at that time Mexico was suffering from fairly severe famine. It was a poor country that couldn't afford huge imports of food to support its population, and there were big problems at that time in Mexico of malnutrition, famine, and starvation. So he went and stayed basically for the next 15 years in the village of Chapingo near Texcoco in the Estado de Mexico, in Mexico City. And he spent his time there breeding new varieties of wheat. First of all, that was going to be efficient in terms of crop yield, and secondly, resistant to disease. There was a big problem at the time with a disease called wheat rust, which destroyed whole crops of wheat. Within 3 years, he'd managed to crossbreed varieties of wheat, and he'd made a strain that was basically resistant to this disease, which was a great success. And it was also more efficient in terms of crop yields. So they planted these new varieties in Mexico, and then they realized there was a second problem. The more efficient or the higher the yields were of the wheat, the more the top of the wheat was top heavy, and therefore the crops collapsed and died. So then he spent the next years again crossbreeding varieties of wheat, varieties that he brought from the US in seed, with local varieties, and he managed to produce a dwarf variety of wheat, so very short stems that had really high crop yields, was suitable for the environment where they were growing in Mexico, and were resistant to disease. And basically, single-handedly, or with his team, by the early 1950s, he'd helped to make Mexico, or the late 1950s maybe, Mexico become self-sufficient in terms of its food production, in terms of wheat production, which was a great success. So he left Mexico in the mid to late 1950s, and then he went to India and Pakistan, and he basically repeated the same process. He crossbred varieties of wheat, and he produced these new, very efficient, high crop yield wheat varieties that he planted in India and Pakistan. Again, a great success. And by the late 1960s, India and Pakistan again were self-sufficient in terms of wheat production. So much so that in 1970 he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and he became largely known within academia and within the agricultural industry as the father of something called the Green Revolution. Now, that doesn't necessarily make him an environmentalist. It doesn't necessarily mean that those countries became sustainable. But what he did do was he provided self-sufficiency. And also he basically saved the lives of hundreds of thousands and millions of people at that time. In the 1980s, he moved on again, and he tried to repeat the success of his work across Africa. He worked in a number of countries in Africa, including Tanzania, Ghana, and Nigeria. And in these African countries, he was working on a resistant and high yield varieties of corn. And it was here that he came up with some problems, which I'll talk about when I talk about the controversies that he caused that resulted from this work. So as I say, some people estimate that he saved the lives of upwards of 1 billion people, and he basically changed agriculture on a global scale. He continued to work up to his death, and he died fairly recently in 2009. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, you might be surprised if I say this work is controversial, but I'll try to say why. First of all, I've said here, he was obviously a technocentric. He believed in using technology to try to solve these economic, social, and environmental problems. So automatically, that puts his work at odds with people with a much more ecocentric approach. Secondly, he found that there was no way around it. In order to produce these high yields that he was after, the crops that he produced, that he developed, needed large inputs of water and large inputs of fertilizer. Obviously, big irrigation schemes can be very damaging to the environment, and large use of synthetic fertilizer again can be very damaging to the environment. And then we looked at the problems of eutrophication and the nitrogen cycle. His work was so successful that approximately 18 million hectares of land across the world are now growing his crops and using the methods that he developed. But by the time in the 1980s that he started to work in Africa, a lot of environmental lobbyists were becoming worried about his work and the effects that they were having on a global scale. I guess you could argue he was a victim of the success of his own work. I think it's necessary to talk about some fairly dark subjects here. A lot of these lobbyists, first of all, were worried about the amount of money that was being spent on LEDCs. And a lot of people rightly or wrongly I would argue, would say that it was wrong to meddle with the natural idea of human carrying capacity. That he was basically allowing people to survive that nature decided should die. And a lot of people said that the problem with that was, or the price was being paid by nature itself. Remember, I said on the last slide about 80 million hectares of land across the world now grow his crops. And single handedly, he basically allowed the population of the world to expand beyond the approximately 3 billion people that were alive when he started his work, up to the current estimate of 7.5 billion people that are alive today. I think a lot of those arguments are wrong. You probably know my thoughts by now about those things. Remember, we looked at the work of Hans Rosling, and we said that the way that you control population is not by condemning people in LEDCs to poverty and subsistence ways of life. You do that by taking people out of poverty, by giving people time away from the work on subsistence farms, and giving people education, and maybe more specifically, giving women rights over their own fertility. So I think it's wrong to argue that he's basically he's responsible for all of the environmental problems that have resulted from overpopulation today. Some other controversies that we could talk about, because a lot of people were not supportive of his work in the 1980s, including the World Bank. He turned to some fairly dubious characters for financial support of his work. Most notably, or his big supporters, perhaps less controversially, one of his big supporters was the ex-president of the US, Jimmy Carter, who was himself a farmer, a peanut farmer. But perhaps worse than that, this guy, a Japanese billionaire, Ryoichi Sasakawa, who was a convicted Japanese war criminal, Second World War. He always said that it was necessity, that he needed money to support it, and he went with people that were prepared to support his work. And then finally, the last thing that he was kind of known for, perhaps controversially, was his support, his favour for genetically modified organisms, GMO research, and GMO crops. His work effectively was on genetically modifying varieties of wheat to find varieties that would grow under certain conditions and be disease resistant and high yield. And he was in favour of doing that through modification of genetics rather than years and years of plant breeding. He was always in favour of GMO. Okay, so that's Norman Borlaug. I don't want to go on too much longer. I thought I'd just finish this by showing you the man himself and letting him speak his own words. So I found a little video in YouTube that I've embedded here. It's from the Nobel Prize Committee, and it's him talking about his work. I don't know if I mentioned he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. Okay, so I hope it's audible.
You can't build peace on empty stomachs. You have three barriers you have to go across: technological, the psychological, and the economic. Mexico became self-sufficient in wheat in about 11 years. Pakistan in about 7 years. The world has now the technology to produce the food that will be needed for the year 2025.
Okay, so that's the story of Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, one of the great humanitarians of the modern age. So I hope you remember him and you remember his work. Okay, take care, everybody. I'll speak to you this week in our class.